Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson, and today's lecture is a presentation on nihilism. So, a general introduction to nihilism and how that concept has originated, especially within the West. So, what follows is basically the set of lecture notes I present to my university level classes when introducing this concept of nihilism, whether it's as part of an introduction to modernist literature or that type of thing. Remember, if you like this type of content, let me know in the comments and I can try to provide more. And also give a like and subscribe. That helps others on their journey find this content. So let's get started. So nihilism, right? Maybe people know this film. The Coen brothers, great directors, have this film, The Big Lebowski, one of my favorites. Very funny, very interesting film. And these intruders burst into the dude's apartment, and they're later identified as nihilists, and they proudly proclaim they have they have accents, and we believes in nothing. So what does it mean to believe in nothing? So this is apparently, according to the movie, what it means to be a nihilist, and they're not far wrong. I think so. The etymology, obviously, nihilism comes from the Latin root word nihil, meaning nothing. So we get even in ancient cosmology in Lucretius, we get nothing comes from nothing. So ec nihilo fit. So we see this root in English in words such as annihilate, so bring to nothing. So nihil is within that word as well. So nihilism is the assertion, paradoxical or self-contradictory assertion to some extent, that nothing is something, that the only foundational reality, the only isness, is nothing. So what is the foundation of our knowledge? Nothing. What aspects of our current social and political systems are founded on the good? Nothing. What is the foundation of ethical values? Nothing. What gives our life meaning? The universe meaning? Nothing. And it's that last question that's usually associated with current forms of nihilism. So as we could see from those questions, the reign of the nothing kind of takes place or can take place in different regions or realms, and this gives rise to different categories of types of nihilism that we can quickly go through now. So you can think of an epistemological nihilism, which posits an extreme skepticism with respect to the possibility of knowledge or truth, and so this has been a position that has had ancient as well as postmodern proponents. So we normally think of that position, that extreme skepticism, with forms of postmodernism, but it has had ancient proponents as well. Again, the term nihilism wasn't attached to this, but it can be at the time, but it can be attached in retrospect. So Socrates, for instance, famously asserted that he knew nothing in the Apology, Plato's Apology, and maybe for Socrates, someone might say, yeah, well that's his claim at the beginning to say, okay, well we know nothing, let's question everything, but that's part of the journey to know something, and maybe that's the case, but certainly that was to form the basis of academic skepticism after Plato and took various forms in ancient Greece and Rome. And Cicero, for instance, was later to assert of Socrates that he himself knows one thing, that he knows nothing. So this is a form of what we could call epistemological nihilism. What can we know? Nothing. The term arose in the 19th century, early 19th century, made popular by Jacobi in relation to critiques of German idealism, but then was picked up probably more systematically in Russia in the latter half of the 19th century and made popular by Turgenev in his novel Fathers and Sons, or Fathers and Children, depending on the translation. And this form of nihilism in late 19th century Russia is what we could call political nihilism. So it asserts that the destruction of all existing political, social, religious order is a prerequisite for any future improvement in the realm of politics and society. So, as I said, it's articulated most fully by Turgenev in this character Bazarov in his novel Fathers and Children. So we get quite a portrait of this nihilist perspective that was in place in intellectual circles in late 19th century Russia. What's notable about this form of nihilism is that there's still a foundation or a firm footing uh, to which they point. So Bazarov believes in the truths of modern science. So the nihil of the term nihilist in this case points to that which will remain of existing structures after the revolutionary refashioning that the nihilist wants. So nothing will remain. So kind of a famous exchange within the novel, Bazarov is speaking with this representative of the older generation, Pavel Petrovich, and the following exchange takes place. At the present time, the most useful thing is negation, so we deny, says Bazarov. Everything? Everything. How can that be? Not only art, poetry, but also, terrible to say, everything, repeated Bazarov with indescribable composure. So we have that first epistemological, political nihilism, and now a third, maybe third/fourth, ethical or existential nihilism. So when it comes to the realm of our ethical values or our notion of the value or meaning of existence, we have nihilism. And as I said, this is probably the nihilism that most people think of when they think of nihilism, that life or existence has no meaning. So, and as I said, since we're talking about meaning and values, we could also see it as we have no basis for our ethical grounds. What is good? What is bad? What is the good life versus what is the bad life? So again, although this, similar to epistemological nihilism, is most often associated with postmodern philosophy, it's had ancient positions or ancient figures who held to some form of this position. For instance, Empedocles, we won't go into that, but this position was also, let's say, articulated most hauntingly by Shakespeare in Macbeth. So Macbeth, in a famous speech in Act 5, states, "Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." So our entire existence is full of sound and fury. Again, the title of a Faulkner novel, I think, echoing this kind of notion of modern nihilism, signifying nothing, that there's nothing beyond these words. The words that are uttered by this actor don't point to anything beyond. They don't point to anything real, substantive beyond. They don't signify. So I want us to think about that. We'll think about that later in terms of nihilism and maybe overcoming nihilism, the question of meaning and signification. Here, signification, the words don't point to anything. In the words of Hamlet, later on, Polonius asks him, "What are you reading?" And he says, "Words, words, words." So the words don't have a signification beyond them. And then finally, and we're going to talk about Nietzsche a bit more than the other figures we rush past quickly because he's the most important figure for us in understanding nihilism. Okay, so what Nietzsche takes those three versions of nihilism and takes them, all in a package um, and includes all of them. He agrees that there's no foundation for knowledge, that nihilism involves absolute destruction, like the political nihilism, and that it results in a lack of meaning. But he adds this dimension of history, that nihilism is historical, and we'll talk a bit about that. So for instance, he says in The Will to Power, a collection of his notes, what does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. The aim is lacking. Why finds no answer. So that's section 2 of The Will to Power. So nihilism in this instance is a process of the devaluing of the highest values. And it takes place over time and has a history. Okay. Whereas before, epistemological nihilism could be seen, or ethical nihilism, as stated, are simply statements about the state of affairs at any time, that we can know nothing at any given time. Here he's saying, okay, well, no, there's a history to how highest values and the meanings in which humans attach to things have evolved and changed and, in a sense, devolved over time. So for Nietzsche, the values that shaped the bulk of the Western tradition were otherworldly values from Platonism and Christianity, and they unfolded as a form of nihilism. And these otherworldly values arose as a devaluing of what the values that preceded them, noble values that valued strength, that type of thing. So they arose as the devaluing of strength, and that is how nihilism unfolds. And now in the modern world, we're rejecting Platonism and Christianity. We see that these otherworldly values lack substance. Well, not everyone, but generally speaking, we live, could be said, in a secular age, and an age that calls into question the Platonic ideals. And in this, we call into question these otherworldly values. We're devaluing those values, but in doing so, we're not moving beyond nihilism. Rather, it's ushered in another historical mode of nihilism. And for Nietzsche, this is the crisis mode of nihilism. In a way, the problem is it's the devaluing those values, and is there space to create new values, and how does one do that? So this crisis of nihilism can be seen as the starting point of Nietzsche's entire reflection. And I think he's often misunderstood in this sense. He's often seen as celebrating or embracing nihilism. But as I said, he sees it as a crisis, and what he calls for its overcoming. And I can refer you to a short little essay I published called What We Get Wrong About Nietzsche's Nihilism, where I talk about a bit more about that. You can see that link there, and I'll put it in the description. And even early in his career, so in a work called The Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life, Nietzsche diagnosed the problem of nihilism under the banner of sovereign becoming, what he called sovereign becoming. And I think it warrants reading that passage. This is from section 9 of that essay, in The Uses and Disadvantages of History. I strongly recommend reading that. It's a very useful piece for thinking about history. If, by contrast, the doctrines of sovereign becoming, of the fluidity of all ideas, types, and styles, and think about today, he's writing in 1874, I think, when this was published, but think about how we have this kind of sovereign becoming, the fluidity of ideas, types, styles. We can't define gender anymore. We can't define what is human versus machine, human versus animal. All these ideas, types, styles, of the lack of all cardinal differences between man and animal. He's writing on the cusp of Darwinian evolution. Doctrines which I consider true but deadly. So let's let that ring with us a little bit. So they may be true, but are they helpful for, again, the title of the essay, Disadvantages of History for Life? Okay, so are these doctrines good for the proliferation of a community, of an individual? If these are still foisted on the people for another generation with the frenzy of instruction, which is now customary, then it should take no one by surprise if people destroy themselves in egotistical trifles and misery through ossification and self-absorption, initially falling apart and ceasing to be a people, then, in place of this condition, perhaps systems of individual egotism, alliances for the systematic larcenous exploitation of those non-members of the alliance, and similar creations of utilitarian nastiness will step forward onto the future scene. So if this continues for another generation, and it's continued for several generations since Nietzsche was writing, he predicts systems of individual egotism, so value systems built around self-actualization and advancement of oneself, alliances of communities looking out for themselves and exploiting non-members. And I think in many ways he could be seen as predicting here many of the atrocities of the 20th century, and we see that in full force, in whether it's through world wars, whether it's through the neglect of millions of genocidal deaths. So early on in his career, he predicts consequences of nihilism, of the fact that we don't have values or cardinal ideas we can attach to, that they would have disastrous effects for individuals as well as for communities, that they wouldn't have a right and a wrong to attach themselves to. And he sees this as I said, as a crisis, not as something that to be celebrated. And he summarizes this also, and probably more famously, in a passage in The Gay Science, another of his works, with the line, "God is dead." So in that passage, section 125 of that work, there's a madman who goes into this marketplace holding a lantern, even though it's broad daylight. And they all ridicule him, and he gives this speech where he utters that God is dead. We discover in that speech, well worth looking at in full, but we discover in that speech that it's humanity that killed God. He says, "Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God's too decomposed. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him." So God is dead. God remains dead, because earlier in Hegelian philosophy, there's this reference to, in the dialectical unfolding of the spirit in the West, we have through the Christian God dying, Christ dying, and then resurrecting, we have this kind of type of the rebirth of and the sublation of the idea or spirit, the dialectical sublation of the idea through history. So this is a response to Hegel in some part. God is dead. God remains dead. It's not being sublate. It's not as though God's dying as one part of an idea and then being dialectically reborn in a new synthesis. God remains dead, and we have killed him. So we'll talk a bit in a second how humanity killed him. But the death of God, we also learn, leaves humanity and the earth, let's say beings as a whole, without direction or a center of gravity. And I think this part sums that up well. What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually and backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? I think this is such a great, say, metaphorical way of describing existence when it's been decoupled from God or the Platonic ideals as a way of anchoring meaning and truth. If there's nothing to attach our existence to, it metaphorically, like the sun, are we not through, as we are in today's, what the cosmologist would tell you is yeah, there's no cardinal directions. Space is this almost infinite nothingness, and it may seem like the ground is down and the sky is up, but that is only relative to your observation. So the madman in the gay science, he comes down and he utters that God is dead. As I said, he's ridiculed. They don't really see the import of this, and he says he comes too early because it, humanity's not ready to hear this. Humanity's not ready to hear this. So I think we can draw a parallel there to um, the return of the philosopher to the cave in Plato's cave allegory. Also to Zarathustra in his attempt to go to the people in part one of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra was his next book that he was to write. And I think Zarathustra, in a lot of ways, picks up on the madman, or could be thought of as the madman in a second incarnation. So I think Nietzsche, like his madman, is not fully understood. So we cover over the emptiness. We read, oh yeah, so today we kind of go, okay, yeah. There's no values. There's no God that centers the whole community, or a sense of a cardinal truth. We say we often live in a post-truth era, that type of thing. And we continue with this lack of direction, maybe because we live with ungrounded remnants of past values. Maybe we say to ourselves, but it's still good to be nice to other people because that's just good. And or we pursue egotism and utilitarian advancement of means as ends in themselves. So I'm quoting egotism and utilitarian from that passage from Uses and Disadvantages of History we just read. So I think to understand why this is the case, we need to turn to the history of nihilism as it's understood by Nietzsche. And we see this most fully in his next books. So his next two books after Zarathustra are Beyond Good and Evil, and then on the Genealogy of Morals, or as it's translated in the image we have here, on the Genealogy of Morality. And he sees really three stages in the unfolding of nihilism over the past several thousand years. So there's a first nihilism of the weak, and I alluded to that early on with this creation of the otherworldly values that we see. So the nihilism of the weak, they've been preyed upon by the strong, and the weak thereby deem that life is suffering and has no value. So in other places, he would call this, let's say, slave morality, that type of thing. So maybe it's a conquered people, or uh, uh, extreme poor tenant farmers who've been pressed into a life of toil without any power, and then the weak despair of this life. This life is worthless. This life is nothing, and create priestly values or afterworlds. They say, well, this life is horrible. Life is nothing, but everything's going to be great in the next life. And so in this life, maybe it seems like weakness is a problem and not having a lot of strength is a problem. But brother, let me tell you, it's going to be important later on. So Nietzsche, of course, famously says this is a teaching based on the spirit of revenge. And the response to this type of nihilism leads to otherworldly philosophy, most powerfully in Platonism, and otherworldly religion, in most powerfully in Christianity. So that's first form of nihilism, and that unfolds for a couple millennia, and but it is accompanied by a will to truth, like a will to see beyond things, to this Hinterwelt, to a world, to an afterworld. And so this is founded by Platonism and Platonism for the people, Christianity. So and it ultimately leads to scientific inquiry. So okay, well, how do we get to this Hinterwelt? Let's examine things and look into what's beyond phenomena, beyond the immediate world. So it leads to science, and then science ends up questioning foundations and discovering that there's no philosophic thing in itself. There's no behind material phenomena, no self or soul behind the material phenomena of oneself, no eternal grounds beyond this life to anchor meaning. So this kind of will to truth, this scientific inquiry ultimately leads to modernity and the let us say the situation in which God is dead and we have killed him. That's how we got there. And the death of God is the death of the Christian God, in the sense that it's no longer something that can anchor meaning for us, but also of those Platonic ideas, broadly speaking, or to any Hinterwelt, any world beyond the thing. So Kantian thing in itself, those types of ideas. So again, we've ripped the veil produced by priests and philosophers um, that that were produced in the wake of the first nihilism. So those have been destroyed. So we're left with life having no value. It is nothing. So we have a new form of nihilism, and this finds expression, I think, most succinctly in the soothsayer, a character in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, who says, "All is empty, all is the same, all has been." So the third form of nihilism for Nietzsche is completed nihilism. So assuming that humanity is able to face the abyss after the death of God and overcome the rule of the good and the just as inheritors of the will to truth, we won't be able to conceal or conveniently forget this deadly truth. We won't be able to just forget that there's absolutely no meaning. So the redemption from the crisis of nihilism won't be a form of going backwards. We'll have to go through. Like, we can't go back, we have to keep going through. So for Nietzsche, the way out of the crisis of nihilism means affirming fully its consequences. And the highest form of affirmation for Nietzsche is affirming the eternal return. So the highest form of affirming the abyss of nihilism, of affirming nothingness, is affirming the eternal return of this abyss. In Zarathustra, it takes the form of the small and meaningless, the fact that he has to accept that the small and meaningless are eternal, and this causes nausea. It's a black snake in the throat of this shepherd in this vision that Zarathustra has, and it chokes him and turns him into a convalescent in part 3 of Zarathustra. So many today, I think, follow Zarathustra's animals. So in part 3 of Zarathustra, in that section where he's contemplating on this black snake that he had a vision about, and they declare, as Zarathustra's animals did, that affirming the eternal return means that beings themselves are liberated to arise as they are outside of externally imposed standards, for instance, Platonic Christian ideals. Okay. And I think that's part of what Nietzsche is getting at. But it's not just that. So his animals declare, okay, so in affirming the eternal return, Zarathustra, it means that all things themselves are dancing. This is great. And how Zarathustra retorts, "Oh, you buffoons, you barrel organs, have you already made a hurdy-gurdy song of this?" So I think people today who say, okay, well, Zarathustra, Nietzsche, in his diagnosis of nihilism, liberates us, and it's a freeing message, I think are not getting the full picture there, and are to some extent similar to Zarathustra's animals in making it a hurdy-gurdy song. It's forgetting that there's still the black snake in the throat, that there's still the acceptance of all things being small and meaningless as well. So Nietzsche, I don't think we've fully grasped Nietzsche, what it means for our era. I think he's still posing those questions which we don't have answers to, and I think, as I said, we can make ourselves content with the fact, oh, okay, that just means that anything goes, and what I say is good, and I think there are shortcomings to that, but let's leave that to the side for now. Building on Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, he follows Nietzsche in seeing nihilism as historical. So Heidegger, probably the most important 20th century philosopher, well, without a doubt, in my mind, the most important 20th century philosopher, spent the 30s delivering a series of lectures, courses on Nietzsche, and his 4-volume in English, it's 4-volume work on with those lecture courses is well worth the read. It's a long read, but well worth it. So he sees nihilism as historical, just as did Nietzsche. For Heidegger, what Nietzsche diagnosed as the history of nihilism is a history of the withdrawal of being. Okay, so beings or entities lose any capacity, we could say, to arise in a meaningful context or whole, a world. The only way they can arise is within the essence of technological in framing, he calls it, Das Gestell, and he calls it this in his essay, The Question Concerning Technology. They arise as stock on call for instrumental purposes, and there they lose their uniqueness and their meaningful character. So something that is merely interchangeable stock on call, one widget among a million widgets in a stockroom that's available for use within a larger technological system, withdraws. It doesn't arise as its unique and meaningful thing as that it is in a world of meaningful actions that a human might interact with, that type of thing. So the danger of nihilism for Heidegger is that things themselves, including humans, the humans as a possibility in which things could arise, that withdraws into nothingness. So in the wake of Nietzsche and Heidegger, but I think fundamentally misunderstanding both of them or taking departures from them, there arose in the 20th century 2 movements that embrace nihilism. And I'll talk briefly about these. So, and there's sometimes these, and I want to talk about them because existentialism and post-structuralism are often associated with nihilism. And so it's good to understand to some extent how they can be linked to nihilism because they are seen as embracing nihilism. Remember, for Heidegger and for Nietzsche, both of whom I think nihilism is the danger, right? The danger of the withdrawal of being, the danger of the fact that we have no anchor to meaning for Nietzsche. So first of all, existentialism, and we could talk about Sartre, but I'll put Camus here. Existence is absurd. Again, building on Nietzsche and Heidegger, existence is without meaning. Yet, for Camus, we need to affirm our existence and carry on in that affirmation of absurdity. And only in doing so are we free, and then we give our lives meaning. So again, I think this position lacks a certain rigor because we're saying nothing has meaning, but if I'm free, I can give it meaning. I'm not exactly certain how this works, although I've read his works a number of times. I strongly recommend The Myth of Sisyphus. It's a very interesting read. Again, I'm not exact. I can follow with the diagnosis. I'm just not sure about the cure that's prescribed and how we get there. And then post-structuralism, Jacques Derrida as an example, or could be, let's say, postmodernist philosophy in general, post-structuralism being a particular branch of that, asserts that there's no anchor or center to structure the meaning of texts or of our lives. So again, we can see how that builds on Nietzsche, right? So if we're reading a text, we need to say that there's certain center of the meaning and that this is marginal, but the whole thematic of the text, the whole message is centered around this. So deconstruction is this a practice of exposing this as an illusion, that there is no center, and then wants to practice this radical decentering, and that's part of what deconstruction does. So there you have it. That's a quick introduction to nihilism. I'm going to stop there. In the next video, I want to talk a bit about ways of thinking about overcoming nihilism. As I said, one path is to embrace nihilism, and there is no meaning, there's no center to text, there's no anchor to our lives. I think following Nietzsche and Heidegger, I think we need to see this as a crisis, and we need to think about ways of overcoming it. And we'll talk a bit about that in our next video. Thank you very much.